"Room 101, said the officer. The man's face, already very pale, turned a color Winston would not have believed possible. It was definitely, unmistakably a shade of green. "Do anything to me," he yelled. "You've been starving me for weeks. Finish it off and let me die. Shoot me, hang me, sentence me to 25 years. Is there somebody else you want me to give away? Just say who it is and I'll tell you anything you want. I don't care who it is or what you do to them. I've got a wife and 3 children. The biggest of them isn't 6 years old. You can take the whole lot of them and cut their throats in front of my eyes, and I'll stand by and watch it. But not Room 101. "Room 101, said the officer.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end.
Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. My name is David Appleson. Today we will examine the Soviet Union's Great Purge under Joseph Stalin. That quotation I read in the introduction is from the famous novel 1984 by George Orwell. Orwell's book pictured a dystopian future where the eyes and ears of the government were everywhere, and ordinary people not only had to be careful about every word they said, but of every thought that passed through their heads. Big Brother was watching, and Big Brother knew everything. It is well known that Orwell was heavily influenced by events that were taking place in the Soviet Union during the time of the Purge, which peaked in the years from 1936 to 1938 and included the imprisonment of up to 6% of the population and the possible execution of over 1 million people. The 17th century philosopher John Locke once said, "A government is not legitimate unless it is carried on with the consent of the governed." That's legitimacy, the acceptance of a ruler or ruler's right to govern over the governed. Since the dawn of societies, basically since the establishment of communities where not everyone was related to each other, the concept of legitimacy has been crucial in government. A ruler must have a right to rule. Sometimes that right is the consent of God or the gods. That was the case in ancient Egypt and medieval Europe. In monarchies, the first ruler in a royal line receives the blessing of God, and then all the descendants of that ruler are assumed by the governed to have the same blessing. In a democracy, consent is conferred by election. The participants agree that the winner of the election has a right to rule based on receiving the most votes. But what happens when a government changes hands? It may take many years of war to establish a new bloodline in a monarchy. But if that change is from the monarchy of the Russian czars to the party rule of Soviet Russia, how do the new rulers determine legitimacy? If you're one of several party leaders, such as Joseph Stalin, and you have no blood right or past history of running anything, you do it through fear, intimidation, and instilling a sense of utter hopelessness in the hearts and minds of anyone who would dare oppose you. On December 23, 1930, Isaac Ilyich Rubin was arrested by the secret police and charged with plotting to form an underground organization called the Union Bureau of Mensheviks. Rubin's sister later reported they put Rubin for days in the kartzer, the punishment cell. "My brother at 45 was a man with a diseased heart and diseased joints. The kartzer was a stone hole the size of a man. You couldn't move in it. You could only stand or sit on the stone floor. But my brother endured this torture too, and left the kartzer with a feeling of inner confidence in himself, in his moral strength." The OGPU, the secret police organization, at that time decided to change their tactics. On January 28, 1931, Rubin was taken to the cell of a prisoner named Vasilevsky. The interrogator told Vasilevsky, "We're going to shoot you now, if Rubin does not confess." The prisoner dropped to his knees and begged Rubin, "Isaac Ilyich, what does it cost you to confess?" According to his sister, "My brother remained firm and calm, even when they shot Vasilevsky right there." The next night they took him to the cell of a prisoner named Dorodnov. This time a young man who looked like a student was there. My brother didn't know him. When they turned to the student with the words, "You will be shot because Rubin will not confess," the student tore open his shirt at the breast and said, "Fascists, gendarmes, shoot!" They shot him right there. The killing of Dorodnov persuaded Rubin to confess to being a member of the Union Bureau of Mensheviks and to implicate his friend and mentor, David Ryaznov. Rubin's sister continued the story. Rubin's position was tragic. He had to confess to what had never existed, and nothing had. Neither his former views, nor his connections with other defendants, most of whom he didn't even know, while others he knew only by chance, nor any documents that had supposedly been entrusted to his safekeeping, nor that sealed package of documents which he was supposed to have handed over to Ryaznov. In the course of the interrogation and negotiations with the investigator, it became clear to Rubin that the name of Ryaznov would figure in the whole affair, if not in Rubin's testimony, then in the testimony of someone else. And Rubin agreed to tell the whole story about the mythical package. My brother told me that speaking against Ryaznov was just like speaking against his own father. That was the hardest part for him. Rubin's story is just one of millions that took place during Joseph Stalin's rule as General Secretary. On May 26, 1922, Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin had his first stroke. Realizing that he may be nearing the end of his life, Lenin admitted to the 10th Party Congress, "We have failed to convince the broad masses. No profound and popular movement in all history has taken place without its fair share of filth, its adventurers and rogues, without noisy and boastful elements. A ruling party inevitably attracts careerists." As his health made it more and more difficult for Lenin to carry on the tasks of leadership, he delegated more power to his subordinates, and he would spend most of his remaining life criticizing the character of those subordinates. Lenin's two most powerful aides were Leon Trotsky, savior of the Red Army, and Joseph Stalin, the strong-willed revolutionary from the province of Georgia. Lenin was already leaning toward Trotsky as his successor, partly because of Stalin's harsh approach to dealing with his former homeland, but mostly because Stalin insulted and threatened Krupskaya, Lenin's wife. Lenin had said of Stalin that he had concentrated an enormous amount of power in Stalin's hands, and Stalin lacked the caution to use it appropriately. That may have been one of history's great understatements. Following the Russian Revolution and the bloody civil war between the white, pro-Tsar Russians and the communist Red Russians that came after the revolution, Lenin moved to consolidate his power by eliminating the two main revolutionary groups that opposed the Bolsheviks, the Social Revolutionaries and the Mensheviks. This feat was accomplished abruptly and brutally with mass arrests, show trials, that is, public trials where the defendant is guilty before tried, and imprisonment. In 1922, at the 10th Party Congress, Lenin outlawed any and all political factions within the Communist Party. From now on, everyone would be on the same page. Joseph Stalin was not your typical Russian revolutionary. First of all, there was the language and nationality barrier. Although he spoke perfect Russian, Stalin spoke with a very thick Georgian accent which immediately identified him as an outsider to most Russians. Next, he was not a great orator or theoretician. The typical pathway to power in post-Tsarist Russia was by giving rousing speeches to the illiterate masses, spouting revered Marxist dogma verbatim. Stalin was not known for his public speaking skills or being well-read. Lenin admired Stalin's expertise as a successful bank robber, kidnapper, extortionist, and assassin. Eventually, the Tsarist authorities arrested him. He was sentenced to political exile in Siberia just prior to the revolution, and spent most of his time hunting and fishing instead of reading socialist theory and expounding on its meaning like the other Bolsheviks. He returned from exile to St. Petersburg in time for the revolution. Once the Soviets took over, Stalin rose to power very rapidly. As Commissar for Nationalities Affairs, he was in charge of pacifying and uniting all the small border nations Russia had recently absorbed. By working behind the scenes, getting himself selected for every important committee, and always taking the most hardline Bolshevik stand possible, he moved up the Soviet hierarchy. In October of 1922, Lenin suffered his second stroke. Many of Europe's top doctors at the time believed the strokes were brought on by metal oxidation caused by bullets lodged in his body from a failed assassination attempt. Modern theorists believe he either had a propensity for high cholesterol levels or that he may even have been poisoned. As a result of his 2 strokes, Lenin was having difficulty speaking, and following the second stroke he started composing his testament, in which he advocated for Trotsky as his successor and the removal of Stalin from his powerful post as general secretary. Lenin found the Georgian too crude and ignorant to make a good party and national leader. However, Stalin had other ideas, and he did not see politeness and eruditeness as important attributes in a Russian leader. While Lenin was incapacitated, Stalin was busy replacing his personal detractors on important committees with his friends and allies. Stalin also worked hard at building a public image as being Lenin's best friend and most likely successor. In March 1923, Lenin suffered his 3rd stroke, which left him confined to a wheelchair. In January of 1924, Lenin fell into a coma in his Gorky home and died later that day. He was 53 years old. Millions came to mourn and see the body of the great founder of the Soviet communist state. Important party leaders like Mikhail Kalinin, Grigory Zinoviev, and Stalin all made speeches during the memorial. Trotsky, convalescing from illness at the time, was conspicuously absent. In the days following Lenin's death, Stalin worked assiduously building relationships with important members of the Soviet hierarchy, including 2 key leaders, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. The 3 of them effectively made up a triumvirate. Perhaps you remember some past triumvirates, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, or Napoleon, Cambaceres, and Lebrun. Triumvirates tend not to last very long, and usually 2 of the triumvirates will get into some kind of hot water, while the 3rd person ends up in charge of everything. You can probably guess which of those 3 Stalin was. Kamenev and Zinoviev helped suppress Lenin's written testament criticizing Stalin. And just as Stalin was consolidating his power in the triumvirate, he had a falling out with his 2 partners. In the power struggle that followed, Stalin had Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Trotsky ejected from the powerful Central Committee, and finally from the Communist Party itself. Stalin was able to replace all 3 former committee members with his hand-picked allies. In October 1926, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Trotsky, in addition to 3 other important Politburo members, found themselves accused of treasonous acts. Trotsky and Zinoviev worked against Stalin from outside the system, holding rallies for the poor masses and setting up printing presses in order to publish anti-Stalin pamphlets. But the poor masses were so alienated by this point they didn't care about the internecine squabbles of the Central Committee, and Stalin had no difficulty shutting down the printing presses. Zinoviev and Kamenev had to spend the next 6 months away from politics altogether, before being allowed back into the party in a much reduced capacity. Trotsky was expelled to Turkey. By now he had become Stalin's public enemy number 1. In the fallout, Stalin was able to secure more seats for his allies in the Politburo, the Soviet legislative body, and on the Central Committee. By 1928, there was no one strong enough to stand in his way, and Stalin effectively became dictator, although he preferred the much less glamorous title of Party General Secretary. Following the mass starvation and disruption caused by the Civil War, Lenin initiated the new economic policy, or NEP, to get the agriculture sector back on its feet and the workers in the cities fed. Lenin encouraged a mix of state-owned farming with private land ownership, moving away from forced collectivization, that is a government-run system, to an incentivized system, got food production going again, and put an end to the famine. Stalin first supported the NEP when he opposed Trotsky, but during the grain procurement crisis of 1928, caused by a disparity between rising peasant incomes and stagnant industrial worker incomes, he switched to a policy of total collectivization. He blamed the grain crisis on gulags, or the relatively wealthy peasants who managed their own farms, accusing them of hoarding their grain until the market rate was favorable. Additionally, the Soviet Union's first 5-year plan was a very ambitious one. They wanted to outpace the West in agriculture and use the surplus revenue to build more industry. In 1929, the Central Committee approved a plan for mass collectivization. As part of this plan, Stalin forcibly relocated the kulaks to remote collectivized farms where they were worked in agricultural labor camps. This forced relocation caused the deaths of a great number of people, mostly women and children. In response, many peasants took up arms against the government soldiers sent to relocate them, and they slaughtered their livestock rather than surrender them to the government. The drive to collectivize continued on, and by 1930 about 60% of Soviet farms were collectivized, up from just 1% under the NEP. The pace picked up when the government sent 25,000 industrial workers out to the countryside to encourage greater collectivization and the further relocation of kulaks. Under the Soviet plan, modern farming equipment and enormous farms would replace the inefficient production of small-scale farming. As forced collectivization turned into a great disincentive for peasants to grow crops, the demand for food grew exponentially as cities increased in size and crops were sold abroad to generate income, to build more factories, and create even bigger cities. When production shrank instead, the central authorities accused the kulaks and other peasants of more hoarding. They raided their farms and took away their seed corn, which is what farmers used to plant next year's crop. So there was no next year's crop, and thus began the Great Famine of 1932-1933, now often called the Holodomor. In the Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, peasants died of starvation by the millions. Those that tried to escape the famine areas were rounded up and sent to gulags or labor camps. Anywhere from 4 to 10 million people died in the Holodomor. The political result of the Great Famine was that Stalin distrusted the peasants and they distrusted him. During the crucial years of the famine, Stalin always felt that the peasants were withholding their surplus crops despite him and the communist government. More broadly, it pitted rural people against city people in a country that was 80% rural, but was about to become a lot more urban. One of Stalin's opponents during this time was Nikolai Bukharin. Bukharin was one of the old guard Bolsheviks, the people who laid the groundwork for the revolution, and were key players when the communists wrested control of the government from the Tsar and his forces. Bukharin supported Stalin and the triumvirate following the death of Lenin, and he supported Stalin when he turned on Kamenev and Zinoviev. In fact, he was very supportive of Stalin until the peasants started dropping like flies during the years of the forced collectivization. Bukharin was public in stating his opposition to Stalin's policies, fearing Russia was returning to an era of feudalism that it had just broken out of. He urged a return to Lenin's NEP policy. Big mistake. Stalin worked quickly to remove Bukharin supporters from the Communist Party. Bukharin reached out to his old enemies, Kamenev and Zinoviev, telling them that Stalin was turning into a modern Genghis Khan. Word of this meeting and Bukharin's statements leaked out, and soon Bukharin found himself stripped of some of his plum responsibilities, like being the editor of Pravda, the national newspaper. Shortly thereafter, he was kicked out of the Politburo. Bukharin led a group of similar-thinking party members who disapproved of Stalin's policies and found the general secretary a bit too tyrannical. One of his protégés was a Central Committee member named Martin Mayan Ryatin, who was also unhappy with Stalin's agricultural policies and the hardships and deaths those policies caused. In 1932, as the famine was devastating the Ukraine, Ryatin, with help from some others in the party, published a document called Stalin and the Crisis of the Proletarian Dictatorship. Don't ask what a proletarian dictatorship is. It's tricky, like all Marxist theory, and was rarely ever seen in practice, like most Marxist theory. The document was secretly circulated to other party members in what came to be called the Ryutin Platform. The document was secretly circulated to other party members in what came to be called the Ryatin Platform. He blamed Stalin's policies for a massive fall in real income, high taxation, and hyperinflation, and faulted Stalin for causing the mass exodus of young people from the countryside to the city. In a second document titled An Appeal to All Members of the Bolshevik Party, Ryatin went even further, describing the destruction of the countryside, the collapse of genuine planning, the imposition of lawlessness and terror on the party and country alike under dishonest, cunning, unprincipled people ready on the leadership's orders to change their opinions 10 times, careerists, flatterers, and lackeys. He went further than that. In conclusion, he stated, Stalin and his clique will not and cannot voluntarily give up their positions, so they must be removed by force, and this should be done as soon as possible. Released in secret, it didn't take long for the appeal to reach the eyes of Stalin, who interpreted Ryatin's words as a call for the General Secretary's assassination. Ryatin was expelled from the Communist Party and subsequently arrested. Stalin had hoped that the OGPU, the predecessor to the NKVD, which was the predecessor to the KGB, would shoot Ryatin without a trial. But they deferred to the Politburo the responsibility of determining Ryatin's fate. At this point, we meet another important character in the Great Purge soap opera, Sergei Kirov. Kirov was a high-placed Communist Party apparatchik. Standing before the entire Politburo, Kirov made a forceful speech imploring his fellow members not to impose the death penalty on Ryatin. Kirov won over many members of the Politburo, and Stalin found himself against the ropes for the first time in many years. It should be noted that Lenin had once admonished his fellow Bolsheviks never to shed the blood of another Bolshevik. A few million peasants is one thing, but a Bolshevik, never. So it should come as no surprise that the Politburo was loath to execute one of its own. Stalin learned 2 important lessons from the Ryatin affair. One, that he could not obtain the consent of his followers to an execution of one of their own based on an interpretation of intended assassination. However, a genuine assassination might do the trick. The second lesson he learned was that the old guard of Bolsheviks was very set in their ways. If they stuck together, they could block his plans and policies. If only there was some way he could combine these 2 valuable lessons into a brilliant contrivance that would make him all-powerful. Sergei Kirov was one of those old guard Bolsheviks. He took part in the failed Russian Revolution of 1905 and was a commander in the Red Army during the Civil War. As a commander, he was known for his ruthlessness against the whites. From the get-go, he was a loyal supporter of Stalin, and Stalin rewarded him for his loyalty by making him leader of the Leningrad Communist Party. Kirov was youngish, good-looking, and charismatic. The party members loved him and gave him long rounds of applause whenever he spoke, in comparison to the light, compulsory applause that Stalin received. In 1934, Kirov was elected to the Central Committee with only 3 votes against him. Stalin received somewhere between 150 and 300 votes against him. We may never know the actual number. Needless to say, Stalin was growing more jealous of his popular, loyal supporter, who seemed to be building his own power base in Leningrad and wasn't afraid to argue with the General Secretary in public. On the afternoon of December 1st, 1934, Leonid Nikolaev entered the Shmalny Institute, the Communist Party headquarters in Leningrad. Nikolaev had been recently expelled from the Communist Party, and he made it quite clear to anyone who would listen that he wanted to get his revenge against the party by taking out one of its highest members. The building guard examined his papers and found everything in order. Inside, Nikolaev traversed the passages of a mostly empty building until he reached Kirov's office on the 3rd floor. There he waited patiently outside. Kirov wasn't scheduled to be in the office that day. He had a speech to deliver that evening and had been at home preparing for it. But he popped in to consult with one of his aides, and as he went to enter his office, Nikolaev shot him in the back of the neck with a Nagant revolver. Kirov died immediately, and Nikolaev was taken into custody by NKVD agents. Nikolaev was tortured for several hours by Genrikh Yagoda, the head of the NKVD, and he eventually implicated Zinoviev and Kamenev in the plot to assassinate Kirov. It was later learned that Stalin had actually ordered Yagoda to arrange Kirov's murder, and Yagoda delegated the assignment to Ivan Zaporozhets, his second-in-command, who identified and recruited Nikolaev to carry out the assassination. Upon receiving news of Kirov's passing, Stalin announced how incredibly grief-stricken he was over the death of his close comrade. Immediately, he boarded a train from Moscow to Leningrad in order to conduct an official inquiry into the events that led to Kirov's murder. From the Smolny Institute, Stalin issued a decree without any consultation in the Politburo. The decree read, 1. Investigative agencies are directed to speed up the cases of those accused of the preparation or execution of acts of terror. 2. Judicial organs are directed not to hold up the execution of death sentences pertaining to crimes of this category in order to consider the possibility of pardon, because the Presidium of the Central Executive Committee of the USSR does not consider as possible the receiving of petitions of this sort. And 3. The organs of the Commissariat of International Affairs are directed to execute the death sentence against criminals of the above-mentioned category immediately after the passage of sentences. The Politburo received a copy of the decree the next day and passed it without remark. Time and again, Stalin would use the cover of a declared state of emergency to bypass legislative procedure. On December 2nd, Hugh Borisov, Kirov's chief bodyguard, most trusted confidant, and key witness to the killing of Kirov, died in an automobile accident, or allegedly died in an automobile accident. Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, would claim later that Borisov was being transported in a truck with several NKVD agents to the Institute for questioning when one of the agents took the wheel and drove the truck into a house. Borisov was the only fatality in the accident, and all of the NKVD agents present in the truck would eventually be shot. In this way, Stalin covered up the killing of the key witness and those who witnessed the killing of the key witness. It later turned out that Borisov had been in on the plot to kill Kirov and was responsible for there being such light security that day. On December 4th, Philip Medved, the head of Leningrad NKVD, was hauled into a court along with 7 of his subordinates for failing to protect Kirov. The court accused them of being white guards or traitors to the nation of the highest order. On December 5th, a circuit judge in Leningrad sentenced 37 people accused of being white guards to death for preparation and organization of terrorist acts against officials of the Soviet regime. In Moscow, 33 others received the same sentence for similar crimes. In Kiev, 28 Ukrainians were apprehended, supposedly while in possession of revolvers and hand grenades. All received death sentences. All of the 28 were either poets, writers, artists, or social workers. During the month of December 1934, scores of people were arrested. It seemed anyone who appeared in an NKVD record was politically suspect. The lucky ones were sent to gulags. The unlucky ones were executed immediately after conviction. In the wake of the Kirov assassination, an atmosphere of paranoia and persecution existed, helped by the Soviet press and party apparatus. Mutual denunciation sessions in which communists fought each other for their party membership and even their lives became the norm. Any voice of moderation or reason was an open invitation to be labeled an oppositionist or traitor. It was no wonder that so many people were executed or imprisoned at this time. That month, a secret letter was sent to all party committees entitled Lessons of the Events Connected with the Evil Murder of Comrade Kirov. The letter called for all party members to hunt down, expel, and arrest all former oppositionists still in the party. A storm of indiscriminate denunciations followed. Anyone with a past association with Trotsky was labeled a Trotskyite, and anyone who knew someone with a past association with Trotsky was also a Trotskyite. It was an age of vague and hostile labeling. By spring 1935, some 30,000 to 40,000 Leningraders were arrested and deported to gulags in Siberia and the Arctic. So what were these gulags? They were a Soviet invention first created in 1918, the year after the revolution. It is actually a Russian acronym which loosely translates to Main Administration of Corrective Labor Camps and Labor Settlements. As the name implies, prisoners were forced into hard labor. A lesson learned in the early Soviet Union, as well as in the days of American and colonial slavery, nothing helps the economy more than free labor. In the gulags, food rations were meager, clothing was inadequate, housing ramshackle, and health care non-existent. Death rates were astronomical. The falsely accused political prisoner worked and lived beside hardened criminals and murderers. Tools and machinery were unheard of. Labor conditions were literally medieval. Andrei Vyshinsky, the chief prosecutor during the Great Terror, described conditions this way in an internal memo. Among the prisoners there are some so ragged and lice-ridden that they pose a sanitary danger to the rest. These prisoners have deteriorated to the point of losing any resemblance to human beings. Lacking food, they collect refuse and, according to some prisoners, eat rats and dogs. These conditions continued until the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, at which point they became much, much worse. 3 weeks after Kirov's murder, arrest warrants were issued for Zinoviev and Kamenev, those two other members of the triumvirate that took power following Lenin's death. On December 27, 1934, they were formally accused, along with 12 others, of conspiring not just to kill Kirov, but also Stalin, Molotov, and party leader Lazar Kaganovich, as well as passing classified information to foreign agents. In 1935, Kamenev and Zinoviev were secretly tried, confessions were coerced, and documented. But it wasn't sufficient for Stalin. He needed something more concrete to show the rest of the Politburo and the party. They were tried in another closed court at the Moscow Center in Leningrad, along with 14 others, Vyshinsky prosecuting. Again, there were more confessions and more convictions. Zinoviev was sentenced to 10 years in prison. 2 other alleged conspirators, Edvatkimov and Byakuyev, got 8 years, and Kamenev received 5. By now Stalin understood the accused had caved in enough to face an open court without embarrassing the General Secretary. In the meantime, Medved and Zaporozhets, the NKVD senior officers who under orders from Stalin arranged for Kirov's murder, were found guilty and imprisoned for not taking sufficient measures to stop the assassination. Stalin decided it was time to go public. Early 1935 to August 1936 was a quiet time during the Purge. Fewer trials and executions. A decree was passed that extended all penalties, including death, down to 12-year-old children. The decree made children more important as witnesses against their parents. If they failed to give the proper accounting, they could be accused of obstructionism or oppositionism and face the appropriate penalty. But Stalin was also keeping busy during this quiet time. He took over direct control of the secret police. He worked within the Politburo to ease the acceptance of false confessions given during public trials. He convinced former oppositionists to admit the error of their thinking in the name of greater party solidarity, and he honed his operatives' talents in extracting confessions under torture, blackmail, and falsification. In August of 1936, Zinoviev and Kamenev were put on trial for the 3rd time in regards to the Kirov murder and conspiracy. Presumably more information would be revealed in this 3rd trial. During the procedures, a foundation was laid for something called the Trotsky-Zinoviev Center, an accusation that Zinoviev and Kamenev, among others, were working directly with Trotsky to overthrow the legitimate Stalin-led government. Zinoviev and Kamenev denied this charge. During the trial, Kamenev was threatened with the execution of his son for his complicity in this conspiracy. In the end, Zinoviev and Kamenev agreed to confess to all of the allegations in return for a promise from Stalin not to execute any of their family or followers. Stalin agreed to these conditions. In January of 1937, a second Moscow trial was held. By now the defendants were openly making confessions of their guilt. Lev Kamenev said, "I, Kamenev, together with Zinoviev and Trotsky, organized and guided this conspiracy. My motives? I had become convinced that the party's, Stalin's policy, was successful and victorious. We, the opposition, had banked on a split in the party, but this hope proved groundless. We could no longer count on any serious domestic difficulties to allow us to overthrow Stalin's leadership. We were actuated by boundless hatred and by lust of power." These words must have been music to the prosecutor's ears. Before the trial, Zinoviev and Kamenev had agreed to plead guilty to the false charges on the condition that they not be executed, a condition that Stalin accepted, stating, "That goes without saying." Nonetheless, a few hours after that conviction, Stalin ordered their execution that night. Shortly after midnight, on the morning of August 25th, 1936, Zinoviev and Kamenev were executed by shooting. In September, Stalin appointed Nikolai Yezhov to replace Yagoda as head of the NKVD. Yezhov quickly arranged the arrest of all the leading political figures in the Soviet Union who were critical of Stalin. The secret police broke prisoners down by intense interrogation. This included the threat to arrest and execute members of the prisoner's family if they did not confess. The interrogation went on for several days and nights, and eventually they became so exhausted and disoriented that they signed confessions agreeing that they had been attempting to overthrow the government. In January 1937, Yuri Pyatakov, Karl Radek, Grigory Sokolnikov, and 15 other leading members of the Communist Party were put on trial. They were accused of working with Leon Trotsky in an attempt to overthrow the Soviet government with the objective of restoring capitalism. Robin Page Arnott, a leading figure in the British Communist Party, wrote, "A second Moscow trial, held in January 1937, revealed the wider ramifications of the conspiracy. This was the trial of the Parallel Center, headed by Pyatakov, Radek, Sokolnikov, Saryabakov. The volume of evidence brought forward at this trial was sufficient to convince the most skeptical that these men, in conjunction with Trotsky and with the fascist powers, had carried through a series of abominable crimes involving loss of life and wreckage on a very considerable scale." Yuri Pyatakov and 12 of the accused were found guilty and sentenced to death. Karl Radek and Grigory Sokolnikov were sentenced to 10 years. One witness commented that Radek gave the condemned men a guilty smile, as though embarrassed by his luck. Maria Svanij, an opera singer and in-law of Stalin, wrote in her diary, "They arrested Radek and others whom I knew, people I used to talk to and always trusted. But what transpired surpassed all of my expectations of human baseness. It was all there: terrorism, intervention, the Gestapo, theft, sabotage, subversion, all out of careerism, greed, and the love of pleasure, the desire to have mistresses, to travel abroad, together with some sort of nebulous prospect of seizing power by a palace revolution. Where was their elementary feeling of patriotism, of love for the motherland? These moral freaks deserve their fate. My soul is ablaze with anger and hatred. Their execution will not satisfy me. I should like to torture them, break them on the wheel, burn them alive for all the vile things they have done." Maria Svanij and her husband Alexander would later be executed by Stalin in the wake of the German invasion. Radek provided the pretext for the purge on a massive scale with his testimony that there was a third organization separate from the cadres which had passed through Trotsky's school, as well as semi-Trotskyites, quarter Trotskyites, 1/8 Trotskyites, people who helped us, not knowing of the terrorist organization, but sympathizing with us, people who from liberalism, from a fronde against the party, gave us this help. In March of 1938, there was a third Moscow trial. This one included 21 defendants, alleged to belong to the so-called bloc of rightists and Trotskyites. Chief among the defendants was Nikolai Bukharin, the high-ranking member of the Politburo, who dared to oppose Stalin during the collectivization campaign, Alexei Rykov, the former premier, Genrikh Yagoda, the former head of the NKVD, and a great many other old-guard Bolsheviks, those most stalwart supporters of the revolution that stood in Stalin's way of absolute power. Bukharin was accused of attempting to assassinate both Stalin and Lenin, and of successfully poisoning the famous writer Maxim Gorky. The defendants were also accused of attempting to overthrow the Soviet government with the aid of the German and Japanese governments. The fact that Yagoda was one of the accused showed the speed at which the purges were consuming their own. Meant to be the culmination of previous trials, it now alleged that Bukharin and others had conspired to assassinate Lenin and Stalin numerous times after 1918 and had successfully murdered the revered Soviet writer Gorky. The group also stood accused of espionage. Bukharin and others were claimed to have plotted the overthrow and territorial partition of the Soviet Union in collusion with agents of the German and Japanese governments, among other preposterous charges. Even sympathetic observers who had stomached the earlier trials found it hard to swallow the new charges as they became ever more absurd, and the purge had now expanded to include virtually every living old Bolshevik leader except Stalin. The preparation for this trial was delayed in its early stages due to the reluctance of some party members to denounce their comrades. That had been one of the reasons Stalin personally intervened to speed up the process and by replacing Yagoda with Yezhov. Stalin also observed some of the trial in person from a hidden chamber in the courtroom. On the first day of the trial, Nikolai Krestinsky, an early Trotsky supporter who later turned against him, caused a sensation when he repudiated his written confession and pleaded not guilty to all the charges. At the trial he stated, "I do not recognize that I am guilty. I am not a Trotskyite. I was never a member of the right-winger and Trotskyite bloc, which I did not know to exist, nor have I committed a single one of the crimes imputed to me. Personally, and in particular, I am not guilty of having maintained relations with the German Secret Service." However, he changed his plea the next day after special measures were used that included the dislocation of his left shoulder, among other things. Bukharin held out for 3 months, but threats to his young wife and infant son, combined with methods of physical influence, wore him down. But after he read his confession, amended and corrected personally by Stalin, he withdrew his entire confession. The examination started all over again with a double team of interrogators. The NKVD used many methods during this time to extract confessions. One method was the conveyor, used to break down a defendant's will. Interrogations took place by relays of policemen and agents, working for hours or days on end. Food and sleep were withheld in intervals, and were often held out as rewards for the desired confession. The conveyor method had a very high success rate, as prisoners would break down from fatigue, often in just hours if not days. The long confession method was used against those with a high willpower and took place over months or years. The prisoner's cell was either too hot or too cold, food tasted good but was in inadequate amounts, and sleep was very intermittent. Glaring lights were used to disorient the victim, and the interrogations could drag on for hours. Prisoners were woken up 30 to 40 times a night, kept standing for hours, and painfully tortured in between. A third method was that of taking hostages. Family members were apprehended by the secret police and kept in separate holding cells. During interrogations of the defendants, personal possessions of their family members were displayed in the interrogation room. Prisoners were told their family members would be tortured or killed if they did not confess to their crimes. If the prisoner would still not break down, these acts were committed in front of their faces. Through these methods, Stalin, by use of the NKVD, could get a defendant to admit just about anything. The tenor of the Great Terror changed when Yezhov took over the NKVD. In fact, the period of 1936 to 1938 that most scholars consider the height of the Great Terror was also known within the Soviet Union as the Yevzhetskaya because Yezhov was so prominent in his pursuit of internal enemies of the USSR. While Yagoda had been somewhat independent, Yezhov was a Stalin man through and through. Under Yezhov, the terror would affect practically every corner of the Soviet regime. He pursued the middle and top cadres within the party, even though these were some of the most pro-Stalin people in the country. It was the lower cadres who whipped up the witch hunt atmosphere in which their senior party members would perish. But it was only a matter of time before even these lower cadres would get consumed in the national dragnet that would also take in rank-and-file bureaucrats, factory workers, and peasants. Brutal interrogation resulted in those arrested implicating others. Some people denounced their friends, family, and co-workers for personal revenge, or in the hopes of obtaining their jobs. Few people could escape suspicion. In such a paranoid atmosphere, how can one know who to trust? One of Yezhov's first assignments was the eradication of his predecessor, Yagoda. Yagoda had made Stalin unhappy by first not making a concrete enough connection between Zinoviev, Kamenev, and the murder of Kirov, and then by questioning the severity of the purge, which he thought was alienating the Soviet people from their government. In March 1937, Yezhov arrested Yagoda on charges of diamond smuggling, corruption, and spying for Germany. Yezhov even planted a sprinkling of mercury around his own office just so that he could blame Yagoda for attempting to murder him. Yagoda was put on trial in March 1938 and found guilty of treason and conspiracy against the Soviet government. He was summarily shot after the trial, and his wife was executed later that year. Yezhov then got busy purging and executing most of Yagoda's appointees in the NKVD, as well as a few of his own appointees, because you can never be too certain. Yezhov dismissed the importance of these lives, even admitting that some of the executed were innocent. What was important was the success of the purge. "There will be some innocent victims in this fight against fascist agents," he said. "We are launching a major attack on the enemy. Let there be no resentment if we bump someone with an elbow. Better than 10 innocent people should suffer than one spy get away. When you chop wood, chips fly." In 1937 and 1938 alone, at least 1.3 million people were arrested and more than 600,000 were shot for crimes against the state. The Gulag population swelled by 700,000 under Yezhov, nearly tripling in size in just 2 years, with at least 140,000 of these prisoners, and probably many more, dying of malnutrition, exhaustion, and the elements in the camps. In the spring of 1937, Stalin decided to take on the only institution remaining that was capable of taking him down, the Red Army. Most dictators rely on a close relationship with their military personnel and the leadership in general. Few dictators would stand a chance without a powerful army to back up the force of their directives. However, by 1937, Stalin felt he had enough power within the party, the Politburo, the NKVD, and the rank and file of the military to take on the generals and officers of the Red Army. That spring, brilliant general and rising star in the Red Army, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, was relieved of his command as assistant to Kliment Voroshilov and transferred to his new assignment in the Volga military district. Only a few weeks into his new command, Tukhachevsky was secretly arrested and brought back to Moscow. Yezhov directly supervised his interrogation and torture, successfully extracting a confession that he was a German agent working with Bukharin to overthrow Stalin. His written confession survives in archives, dappled with a brown spray, later revealed to be blood. Along with Tukhachevsky, 8 other Red Army generals were arrested, including several army commanders, the head of the Civil Defense Organization, the head of the Military Academy, and the head of the political administration of the Red Army. On June 11th, the Soviet Supreme Court convened a special military tribunal. The trial was dubbed the case of Trotskyist anti-Soviet military organization. The accused were allowed no representatives to defend them, and appeals were forbidden. The 9 defendants were found guilty that day. Stalin approved the sentence of death without even reading the trial transcript. An hour later, Tukhachevsky and the other generals were executed with a bullet to the back of the head. Tukhachevsky and this corps of other young generals had been the ones most responsible for modernizing the Russian army from one that had been embarrassed and humiliated by the Germans in World War I to the powerful fighting force that invaded Berlin and helped bring down the Nazi regime in World War II. Within 9 days of the trial, more than 980 Red Army officers were arrested, including 21 corps and 37 divisional commanders. That was followed by the execution of 20 generals from Moscow headquarters and the arrest of almost the whole of the Kremlin military school. Thousands of officers were arrested in the provinces. Anyone who was thought to have a connection to anyone who was thought to have acted treasonously against the Soviet government. Most of those arrested were killed. Virtually all of the army commanders were executed. According to documents released after Glasnost, the number of officers arrested was over 43,000. The same document states that more Soviet generals died during peacetime under Stalin than during all of World War II. Even the new replacements for the executed officers were themselves arrested and often executed. The end result was a pacified army that Stalin felt was under his complete control. However, the consequences were disastrous. The Russian soldiers and advisors assisting the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War were badly beaten by Francisco Franco and his German and Italian allies. The Soviets took horrendous casualties in the Winter War of 1939-1940 against the small army of Finland. When the Germans invaded in 1941, the absence of effective leadership in the Soviet military led to the Nazi forces overrunning millions of Red Army soldiers. The purge wasn't just isolated to Moscow. It took place all over the Soviet Union, in Russia and in the provinces. Stalin seemed to take out a special vengeance against Leningrad, previously and now known as St. Petersburg. For one, it was the most European of Russian cities, lying in close proximity to other Baltic nations. Two, it was the location of Kirov's murder, and Stalin was quick to attack anyone even remotely connected to the murder, including some of his closest allies. Party ranks were thinned down to practically nothing before being replenished with hand-picked Stalin appointees. Of the 154 delegates that attended the 27th Congress, only 2 remained to attend the 28th 1 year later. In the Central Asian republics, virtually the entire leadership was purged, as well as a great number of ordinary citizens with no political connections whatsoever. In the Bakivnia forest outside Kiev, a mass grave of over 100,000 victims of the purge was discovered. At Kuropati, near Minsk in Belarus, another mass grave was found that contained the remains of anywhere from 30,000 to 300,000 victims. In July of 1938, the last of the massive show trials was held. All of the accused were staunch Stalinists. Their only crime had been in asking for some leniency towards certain party leaders or displaying lack of appropriate enthusiasm for the extreme measures used in the purge. On July 28th, Yezhov sent Stalin a list of 138 names of party leaders and Politburo members asking for permission to execute them. Stalin and Molotov signed the agreement. "Shoot all 138 was the succinct response. That week, there took place in secret the largest massacre of the leadership during the entire purge. Military leaders, political leaders, diplomats, poets, and writers. The trial marked the transition away from massive purges. In his typical paranoid fashion, Stalin was beginning to show a deep distrust of Yezhov. In April 1938, Yezhov was appointed People's Commissar for Water Transport. For a number of years, Yezhov had maneuvered to eliminate one of his greatest rivals, Lavrentiy Beria, the party leader of Georgia, Stalin's birthplace. In 1938, Yezhov submitted an arrest order for Beria, but it was overturned by Molotov. In July, Beria was appointed the new head of the NKVD. Yezhov kept as many other titles, but head of the secret police would not be one of them. It was reported that Stalin was disappointed in Yezhov's inability to put on more public trials, while other top leaders were also moving against Yezhov. However, once Beria took over, the show trials and most of the purges ended. Perhaps Stalin had felt he had rid himself of any perceived internal threat, or he was left with a generation of cadres who refused to confess their crimes in public because they had never had a bad thought about Stalin in their lives. In September, Yezhov's second-in-command was relocated to an assignment in the Navy. Yezhov could see the writing on the wall. The relocating of important lieutenants was a certain sign that a leader was about to be accused of a political crime and put on trial. Yezhov sank into a period of despair and alcoholism. In November, Yezhov's wife, also fearing persecution, committed suicide by overdosing on sleeping pills. In April 1939, Yezhov was arrested and imprisoned. Under torture, Yezhov confessed to the standard litany of state crimes necessary to mark him as an enemy of the people, prior to execution, including malfeasance, theft of government funds, and treasonous collaboration with German spies and saboteurs. In his final hours, Yezhov proclaimed his faith in Stalin. He was tried and convicted by a secret military tribunal. 2 days later, he was shot by the future head of the KGB. His death was kept secret from the public. For the remainder of his life, Stalin used Yezhov as a convenient scapegoat when assigning blame for the horrors of the Great Purge. In 1953, shortly after the death of Joseph Stalin, Beria, whose reputation for cruelty would outweigh Yezhov's, was accused of treason and found guilty by a group of party leaders headed by Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's eventual successor. The executioner had to place a gag in Beria's mouth to keep him from bawling. On August 20th, 1940, Leon Trotsky was struck in the head with a mountaineering ice axe by an assassin hired by the NGVD. He died a day later from shock and blood loss. Trotsky had finally worn out his usefulness to Stalin. As to the total number of persons imprisoned or executed during the era of the Great Purge, it is difficult to come up with an exact number. According to declassified Soviet archives, during the years 1937 and 1938, the NKVD detained 1,548,366 persons, of whom 681,692 were shot, an average of 1,000 executions a day. For comparison, the Tsarists shot 4,000 people for political crimes during a period covering 85 years. One significant source claims that between 5.5 and 6% of the population were arrested from 1936 to 1938. If the number of people killed includes those who died in jail or the gulags, the final figure could be easily in the millions. If we include the millions who died in the Holodomor, it is not too difficult to understand one of the main reasons the purge came to an abrupt end. The Soviet Union was quickly exhausting the people who were keeping the nation running. How much sooner the German invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II could have ended and the millions of lives saved because of that, we will never know. When Stalin took over the reins of power in the 1920s, he promised that he would bring the Soviet Union into the modern industrial age and be able to compete with the best-performing nations in Europe. By the end of World War II, the USSR had become one of the largest economies in the world. But just like Mao Zedong and China, the cost in human lives for such growth would be horrendous. Machiavelli once said, "It is better to be feared than loved, but it is best to be both." Like Winston Smith, the central character in 1984, learned, Stalin managed to achieve the best of both worlds. Thank you for joining me for the podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom@aol.com or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. Or you can express your feelings through Facebook via an emoticon. There's more to life now than just liking. This would be a great time for you to ask me questions about any of the previous episodes or potential future episodes. I appreciate your suggestions, and I try as much as possible to include them. Episodes like the sinking of the naval ship Wilhelm Gustloff, the Lisbon earthquake, and the Hillsborough crush came from listener suggestions. Unfortunately, I find life intervening again. I will be preparing to take a professional exam that relates to my day job between now and the summer. This may severely limit the amount of time I can commit to the podcast. I would like to keep posting episodes or interludes during this time, but I won't be able to put out my current rate of 1-hour episodes twice a month. I apologize, but, the bills have got to get paid. I'm exploring the next group of episodes for my return to full-time podcasting in the summer. Some early suggestions include the Ancash earthquake and avalanche in Peru, the Lake Nyos carbon dioxide release in Cameroon, St. Lucia's flood in northern Europe, 1815, the year without a summer, a global event, the story of the shipwreck Batavia about a Dutch ship that struck a reef off the coast of Australia, and the crackdown at Tiananmen Square in China. Keep listening and keep sending email. Until next time, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.